Baby's night. Light attracts bear moths. Nature creates magic for him. The tapping started 3 nights after they brought Leo home from the hospital. It was soft at first, so soft that Ethan thought he was imagining it, the way new parents imagine all sorts of sounds in those sleepless early days. The cabin sat deep in the pine forest, 20 miles from the nearest town, and they'd chosen it specifically for the quiet, for the peace they thought would help them adjust to their new life as a family of 3. But that night, as Ethan stood over Leo's crib at 2 in the morning, watching his son's tiny chest rise and fall, he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Against the window, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone gently knocking with a single finger. He froze, his protective instincts immediately alert. But when he looked toward the window, he saw nothing but darkness beyond the glass. The small nightlight they'd plugged into the wall cast a warm amber glow across the nursery, painting shadows of the mobile's wooden animals on the ceiling. Leo slept on, undisturbed, his little fists curled beside his head, and Ethan told himself it was just a branch, just the wind, just his exhausted mind playing tricks. Lily stirred when he climbed back into bed, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Everything okay?" she whispered, and he squeezed her fingers gently, not wanting to worry her with what was probably nothing. "Fine," he said, just checking on him. She was asleep again within seconds, but Ethan lay awake, listening. The tapping had stopped, but something about it nagged at him, something about the pattern, the consistency. It hadn't sounded like a branch at all. Branches scraped and scratched, moved by wind in irregular patterns. This had been deliberate, almost like a code, almost like something wanted their attention. He thought about the isolation of their cabin, how they'd loved it when they'd first moved in 6 months ago, before Lily got pregnant, when they'd spend weekends hiking the trails and sitting by the fire pit, watching stars through gaps in the pine canopy. Now, with a newborn in the house, that isolation felt different. Not threatening exactly, but charged with a new kind of responsibility. Every sound mattered more. Every shadow could be something. The next night, Ethan was ready. He'd spent the day checking the perimeter of the cabin, looking for loose branches, examining the window frame of Leo's room for any damage or gaps that might create odd sounds. Everything looked normal. The window was solid, double-paned, installed just 2 years ago when the previous owners had renovated. No trees grew close enough to touch it. By the time darkness fell, he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined the whole thing, but he still found himself sitting in the rocking chair in Leo's room as Lily went to bed early, exhausted from a day of feeding and changing and soothing. "You sure you don't mind?" she'd asked, and he'd kissed her forehead, told her to rest, that he wanted some time with his son anyway. It wasn't a lie. He loved these quiet hours with Leo, loved watching the baby's face twitch with dreams, loved the weight of this new responsibility even as it terrified him. The nightlight glowed steadily, and Leo slept in his sleep sack, arms spread wide like he was embracing the world even in his dreams. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the tapping began. Ethan's eyes snapped to the window, his heart rate spiking, but again he saw nothing. The sound was louder tonight, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. He stood slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements, and crept toward the window. The tapping stopped the moment he got close, as if whatever was making it could sense his approach. He pressed his face to the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the reflection of the nightlight, and peered into the darkness. The moon was new, offering no help, and the forest was a wall of black beyond the window. He stayed there for several minutes, waiting, watching, but nothing moved. When he finally returned to the rocking chair, the tapping didn't resume. Leo slept through it all, his breathing deep and even, and Ethan found himself envying his son's ignorance, his complete trust that the world was safe, that his parents would handle whatever came. By the third night, Ethan had a plan. He set up his phone to record video, positioning it on the dresser with a clear view of the window. He also grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the powerful one they used for emergencies, and kept it beside the rocking chair. Lily noticed his preparations and raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" she asked. And this time he told her about the tapping. Trying to keep his tone light, trying not to sound like he was losing it. She listened carefully, then surprised him by saying she'd heard it too, had thought it was him checking something outside. "Maybe it's an animal," she suggested. "A raccoon or something, attracted to the light?" It was a reasonable explanation, and Ethan wanted to believe it, but something in his gut said it was more than that. Animals didn't tap in patterns. Animals didn't stop the moment you approached. That night, Lily joined him in the nursery, both of them sitting on the floor beside the crib, backs against the wall, waiting. They talked in whispers about Leo's day, about how he'd gripped Lily's finger during feeding, about the funny face he'd made during his bath. Normal parent talk, the kind that would have bored them to tears a year ago, but now felt like the most important conversation in the world. At 2:17 a.m. exactly, the tapping began, and they both tensed. It was louder than ever, more complex in its rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. Pause, tap, pause, tap, tap. Like Morse code, like a message. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and stood, but Lily caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at Leo." Their son was awake, his dark eyes wide open, staring at the window. Not crying, not fussing, just watching with an intensity that seemed impossible for a 2-week-old baby. The tapping continued, and Leo's eyes tracked something, moving slowly from left to right across the window. Ethan followed his son's gaze and finally saw it. At first, it looked like a piece of bark had somehow stuck to the outside of the glass, a dark patch against the darker night. But then it moved, and he realized it was alive. Some kind of insect, but massive, the size of his palm. As his eyes adjusted, he saw more of them, dozens clustered on the window, their bodies furry and thick. The tapping sound came from their wings or bodies gently hitting the glass as they moved. "Moths," Lily breathed beside him, and he saw she was right. Enormous moths, unlike any he'd seen before, their bodies covered in what looked like brown fur, their wings patterned with eye spots that seemed to stare back at them. They moved slowly, deliberately, not with the frantic energy of normal moths around light, but with something almost like purpose. "Should we do something?" Lily asked, but neither of them moved. There was something hypnotic about watching them, something peaceful despite their size and strangeness. Leo made a small cooing sound, his first real vocalization beyond crying, and the moths seemed to respond, their movements becoming more synchronized, more dance-like. They spiraled around each other on the glass, creating patterns that shifted and reformed, and their shadows, cast by the nightlight, played across the nursery walls like a naturally occurring mobile. "They're beautiful," Lily said after a long moment. And Ethan found himself agreeing. The initial fear had faded, replaced by wonder. These creatures, whatever they were, didn't feel threatening. They felt like visitors, like they'd come specifically to see Leo. They watched for an hour, maybe more, time losing meaning in the strange peace of the moment. The moths never tried to get inside, never became agitated. They simply moved in their slow patterns, occasionally tapping against the glass in their rhythmic way, and Leo watched them until his eyes grew heavy and he drifted back to sleep. Only then did the moths begin to leave, peeling away from the window one by one, disappearing into the forest darkness. The last one lingered, its eye spots seeming to look directly at Ethan through the glass, and then it too was gone. The nursery felt different in their absence, not empty, but charged with something, like the air after a thunderstorm. Lily leaned against Ethan's shoulder, and they sat in silence, processing what they'd witnessed. "We need to find out what they are," she finally said, and Ethan nodded, already mentally composing the search terms he'd use, already wondering who they could ask about massive moths in the pine forest. The next morning, Ethan drove into town while Lily stayed with Leo. He stopped at the library first, finding books on local wildlife, on insects of the Pacific Northwest, but nothing matched what they'd seen. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, who'd lived in the area her whole life, noticed him flipping through field guides and asked what he was looking for. When he described the moths, trying not to sound too crazy, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Bear moths," she said immediately. "Haven't heard about them in years. My grandmother used to tell stories." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a worn journal, handwritten in fading ink. "Local folklore," she explained, opening to a page with a sketch that made Ethan's breath catch. It was them, exactly as he'd seen them, down to the eye spots and the fuzzy bodies. According to the journal, bear moths were seen as good omens, particularly around newborns. The indigenous people of the area had considered them guardian spirits, drawn to new life to offer protection and blessings. They appeared rarely, usually in remote areas and always at night. "My grandmother claimed to have seen them once," Margaret said. "When my mother was born, said they came every night for a month, then never again. My mother lived to be 93, never sick a day in her life." She photocopied the pages for Ethan, refusing his offer of payment. "Just promise to take good care of that baby," she said, and something in her eyes suggested she believed every word of the folklore. Ethan stopped at the general store on his way home, picking up supplies and casually asking the owner, Tom, if he'd ever heard of bear moths. Tom's reaction was immediate and surprising. "You've seen them?" he asked, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. When Ethan nodded, Tom called his wife from the back room. "Sarah, this young man's seen the moths." Sarah emerged, flower in her hair from the bakery section, her eyes bright with excitement. "Where?" she asked, and when Ethan explained about the cabin, about Leo, she clasped her hands together. "A blessing," she said firmly. "That's what they are. We saw them when our Jenny was born 30 years ago, just once, but I'll never forget." She described the same slow, hypnotic movements, the same peaceful feeling, the same sense that they'd witnessed something beyond ordinary nature. By the time Ethan got home, he had 3 more stories from people in town, all similar, all involving newborns, all describing the moths as gentle, protective presences. Lily listened to everything, holding Leo against her chest, occasionally looking toward the window as if expecting to see them even in daylight. "So we're not crazy," she said with relief, and Ethan laughed, realizing how much they'd both been worrying about that. That night, they prepared differently. Instead of anxiety, there was anticipation. They brought cushions into the nursery, made themselves comfortable. Lily even made tea, bringing 2 steaming mugs that filled the room with the scent of chamomile. Leo seemed to sense their mood, staying awake as 2:17 approached. His eyes already turned toward the window. The moths came exactly on time, more of them tonight, covering the entire window. In the better light of their preparedness, Ethan could see more details. Their wings weren't just brown, but contained subtle patterns of gold and amber, catching the nightlight's glow. Their bodies were indeed covered in fur that looked soft enough to pet, and their antennae were feathered like tiny ferns. They moved in waves across the glass, creating ripples of movement that were almost musical in their rhythm. Leo gurgled happily, his tiny hands reaching toward them, and the moths seemed to respond, clustering wherever his attention focused. "It's like they're performing for him," Lily whispered, and that's exactly what it looked like. A show, a dance, a lullaby made of movement and shadow. Over the following weeks, the moths became part of their routine. Every night at 2:17 a.m., without fail, they would appear. Ethan and Lily took turns staying up to watch, sometimes together, sometimes alone, but always with the same sense of wonder. They tried taking photos, but the images never captured the magic of the moment, always coming out blurry or too dark. They decided that was okay, that some things weren't meant to be documented, only experienced. Leo's sleep patterns adjusted to the moths' schedule, often waking just before they arrived, as if he had an internal clock tuned to their presence. He would watch them until they left, then sleep deeply until morning, more peacefully than any baby they'd heard about from their parent friends. One night, about 3 weeks into the moths' visits, something different happened. Ethan was alone with Leo, Lily catching up on desperately needed sleep, when the tapping started earlier than usual. It was 1:30 a.m. and the rhythm was different, urgent somehow. Ethan went to the window and saw only one moth, larger than the others, its eye spots seeming to pulse in the dim light. It tapped insistently, then flew away from the window, circling back, tapping again, repeating the pattern. It wanted him to follow. Every rational part of Ethan's mind said not to go, not to leave Leo, not to follow a giant moth into the forest at night. But something deeper, some instinct he didn't fully understand, told him this was important. He bundled Leo carefully, wrapping him in extra blankets, and carried him to the door. The moth was waiting, hovering at head height, its wings beating slowly. When Ethan stepped outside, it moved forward, staying just within sight, leading them down the familiar path behind the cabin. The forest was alive with night sounds, crickets and owls and the rustle of small animals, but Ethan felt no fear. The moth's presence was calming, protective even. They walked for maybe 5 minutes, Leo alert and quiet in his arms, before the moth stopped at a small clearing Ethan had never noticed before. The trees formed a perfect circle here, their branches creating a natural dome overhead, and in the center hundreds of bear moths had gathered. They covered every surface, the trees, the ground, even hovering in the air, their wings creating a soft humming that was almost like music. As Ethan stepped into the clearing, they all turned toward him and Leo, their eye spots creating the illusion of being watched by countless gentle guardians. Then, one by one, they began to glow. Not brightly, but with a soft bioluminescence he hadn't known they possessed, a warm golden light that pulsed in waves across the gathering. Leo laughed, his first real laugh, the sound pure and delighted, and the moth's glow intensified in response. They rose into the air, swirling around father and son in a living constellation, their light creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, like messages in a language older than words. Ethan stood in the center of it all, tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the beauty and strangeness and absolute rightness of the moment. He understood then that this was a ceremony of sorts, a welcome for Leo into the world, performed by creatures that existed in the margins between the mundane and the magical. The dance went on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the moths moving in increasingly complex patterns, their glow painting the clearing in shifting shadows and light. Finally, they began to settle, the glow fading, returning to their normal appearance. The large moth that had led them here approached, hovering directly in front of Leo's face. Leo reached out with one tiny hand, and for just a moment his finger touched the moth's furry body. The moth trembled, then flew upward, and all the others followed, dispersing into the forest in a matter of seconds. The clearing was empty and dark, but the air still felt charged with something wonderful. Ethan stood there for a long moment, holding his son, feeling like they'd been given a gift he couldn't quite name. When he finally walked back to the cabin, Lily was waiting at the door, having woken to find them gone. He tried to explain what had happened, but words felt inadequate. She looked at Leo, who was gazing up at her with bright, alert eyes despite the late hour, and seemed to understand anyway. "They blessed him," she said simply, and Ethan nodded, knowing that was as close to the truth as words could get. They went back inside, settled Leo in his crib, and watched him fall into the deepest, most peaceful sleep they'd seen yet. The moths continued to come every night for another week, but their visits felt different now, less urgent, more like friends checking in. The numbers gradually decreased, from dozens to a handful, and their dances became simpler, more like lullabies than performances. Ethan and Lily treasured each visit, knowing somehow that they were coming to an end. On the last night, only 3 moths came. They stayed for just a few minutes, tapping gently at the window, their eye spots seeming to convey a farewell. Leo, now 6 weeks old, watched them with the focused attention he was beginning to show for everything in his expanding world. When they flew away, disappearing into the forest for what Ethan and Lily somehow knew was the final time, the nursery felt different. Not empty, but complete, like the end of a perfect story. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Leo slept through the nights now, peaceful and content. Ethan and Lily found themselves checking the window at 2:17 a.m. for a while, but the moths never returned. They talked about the experience often, trying to make sense of it, but eventually accepted that sense-making wasn't the point. They had been given something rare and beautiful, a glimpse into a world where nature still held mysteries, where blessings came in unexpected forms. When friends visited and commented on how calm and happy Leo seemed, how he rarely cried and smiled more than any baby they'd known, Ethan and Lily would exchange knowing looks, but keep the story of the moths to themselves. Some magic, they'd learned, was meant to be held close, treasured in the quiet hours of memory. Months passed, and Leo grew. He learned to roll over, to sit up, to crawl. His first word was light, which he said while pointing at the nightlight that still glowed in his room. His second was fly, accompanied by a waving gesture that looked remarkably like wings. Ethan and Lily wondered if he remembered the moths, if some part of that experience had imprinted itself on his developing consciousness. They kept the photocopied pages from the library in Leo's baby book, along with a blurry photo Ethan had managed to capture of a single moth on the window. When Leo was older, they would tell him the story, but for now they simply watched him grow, aware that he had been touched by something special, something that had marked the beginning of his life with wonder. One evening, when Leo was almost a year old, Ethan was reading him a bedtime story when he heard a familiar sound. A gentle tapping at the window. His heart leaped, and he looked up to see a single bear moth, its eye spots gazing in at them. It stayed for just a moment, long enough for Leo to see it and point with excitement, babbling in his baby language. Then it was gone, leaving Ethan with the feeling that it had simply been checking in, making sure all was well. He mentioned it to Lily later and she smiled. "Maybe they'll come back when we have another baby," she said, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. Ethan's eyes widened and she nodded, her smile growing. "I just found out today." That night, Ethan stood at Leo's window, looking out into the dark forest, thinking about cycles and blessings and the mysteries that still existed in the world. Somewhere out there, the bear moths were living their secret lives, waiting perhaps for the next new soul to welcome. He thought about the old stories Margaret had shared, about generations of families who had seen the moths, each keeping the secret, each passing down the tale in whispers and wonder. Leo slept peacefully in his crib, and Ethan imagined telling him someday about the night he was blessed by creatures that shouldn't exist but did, about the magic that had surrounded his arrival in the world. The night light glowed steadily, a beacon in the darkness, and Ethan found himself hoping it would call the moths again, that his second child would know the same strange blessing. The forest kept its secrets, but sometimes, on very quiet nights, Ethan thought he could hear the soft humming of wings in the distance, like a lullaby carried on the wind. He and Lily had learned to listen for it, to pause in their busy days and remember that they had witnessed something extraordinary. They had been chosen, somehow, to see beyond the veil of ordinary life, to know that magic still moved in the world, disguised as moths, as light, as the laugh of a baby who had been touched by wonder. Their cabin in the woods had become more than a home. It had become a place where the impossible had happened, where nature had revealed one of its most beautiful secrets. As autumn turned to winter and Leo's first birthday approached, Ethan often found himself thinking about the clearing in the forest. He'd tried to find it again during daylight, but it seemed to have vanished. Or perhaps it only existed when it needed to. He didn't mind the mystery. Some things, he'd learned, weren't meant to be fully understood, only accepted and treasured. The bear moths had taught him that, had shown him that parenthood itself was a kind of magic, a transformation as profound as any folklore creature. He watched Leo explore the world with endless curiosity, touching everything, examining each leaf and stone as if it might hold secrets, and knew that the moth's gift had been more than just a blessing. They had opened a door to wonder that would never fully close. Lily felt it too, this sense of living in a world larger and stranger than they'd imagined. She'd started painting again, something she hadn't done since college, trying to capture the memory of the moths in watercolors. The paintings never quite matched what they'd seen, but the act of creating them kept the experience alive, kept it from fading into the kind of memory that makes you doubt what you saw. She painted them on the nursery walls eventually, a subtle mural of moths and moonlight that visitors assumed was just whimsical decoration. Only she and Ethan knew it was a document, a testament to the night their son was welcomed by the forest itself. The news of the second pregnancy spread through their families, bringing excitement and congratulations. Ethan and Lily accepted the well wishes with smiles, but privately they wondered if the moths would return. They prepared the nursery for 2 children now, keeping the same nightlight, the same window view of the forest. Sometimes Leo would stand at the window, his small hands pressed against the glass, looking out with such intensity that they wondered what he was watching for. "Fly," he would say sometimes, his voice hopeful, and they would nod and tell him, yes. Maybe the flies would come back someday. They didn't correct him, didn't try to explain that they were moths, not flies. In Leo's simple language, he had captured something essential about them. They were creatures that flew, that visited, that belonged to the air and the night. As Lily's pregnancy progressed, the anticipation grew, not just for the new baby, but for the possibility of the moth's return. They didn't talk about it much, afraid that expecting them might somehow prevent their appearance. Instead, they focused on preparing Leo to be a big brother, on choosing names, on all the normal preparations that expecting parents make. But underneath it all was this current of hope, this sense that they were waiting for something more than just a birth. They were waiting to see if the magic would happen again, if their second child would receive the same mysterious welcome that Leo had. The forest around their cabin seemed to pulse with hidden life as spring arrived. More birds than usual, more butterflies, more of everything, as if nature itself was preparing for something. Ethan found himself walking the trails more often, always half looking for signs of the moths, never finding any. They remained invisible until they chose to be seen, living in some parallel world that only intersected with theirs at special moments. He thought about all the people in town who had seen them, all the stories passed down through generations, and felt part of something larger, a community bound not by proximity but by shared wonder. One afternoon, old Jacob from down the road stopped by with fresh eggs from his chickens. He was nearly 90, had lived in these woods his whole life, and as he handed over the eggs, he looked at Lily's growing belly and smiled. "They'll come," he said simply, and both Ethan and Lily knew exactly what he meant. "My mother saw them when I was born," Jacob continued, his voice soft with memory. "And I saw them when my daughter came into the world. They don't come for everyone, you know, only for some, only when they sense something special." He patted Leo's head gently, the toddler grinning up at him. "This one's got the mark. I can see it in his eyes. The next one will too." He left without explaining what he meant by the mark, but his words stayed with them, adding another layer to the mystery. As Lily entered her third trimester, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of impending arrival that went beyond the normal anticipation of birth. Leo became more attentive to the window at night, often waking around 2 a.m. and going to stand by the glass, waiting. He never cried or fussed, just watched with patient expectation. Sometimes Ethan or Lily would join him, and they would stand together in the amber glow of the nightlight, a family waiting for something they couldn't quite name. The forest seemed to wait with them, unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. 3 weeks before Lily's due date, on a night when the moon was dark and the stars were hidden by clouds, Leo woke them with excited babbling. He was at his window, jumping up and down, pointing. Ethan and Lily rushed to look, and there, for the first time in almost a year, was a single bear moth. It was massive, possibly the same one that had led Ethan to the clearing, its eye spots seeming to glow with their own light. It tapped once, twice, 3 times, then flew away. But the message was clear. They were coming back. The countdown had begun. That night, none of them could sleep. They sat together in the living room, Leo on Lily's lap, talking about everything and nothing, feeling the weight of approaching change. The pattern continued for the next 3 weeks. Every night a single moth would appear, tap 3 times, and leave. It felt like a countdown, a promise, a preparation. Lily went into labor on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days past her due date. It was faster than with Leo, more intense, and by evening they were at the small local hospital, the same one where Leo had been born. The delivery was smooth, and by 11 p.m. their daughter was here. They named her Avery, and she was perfect, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything already. The nurses commented on how alert she was, how she seemed to be studying the world from her first moments. They brought Avery home the next day, settling her into the nursery next to Leo's crib. Leo was fascinated by his sister, gentle in the way they'd taught him, reaching out to touch her tiny fingers with wonder. That night, they all gathered in the nursery, even though the doctors had said Lily should rest. They couldn't miss this, couldn't not be present for what they knew was coming. At exactly 2:17 a.m. the tapping began, but this time it wasn't just at one window, it was at every window in the cabin, a symphony of gentle percussion that seemed to make the whole house vibrate with welcome. Leo laughed and clapped, and Avery, impossibly, seemed to turn her head toward the sound, her hours-old eyes trying to focus. The moths covered every window, more than they'd ever seen, their bodies creating a living curtain between the cabin and the forest. They moved in perfect synchronization, a dance that seemed choreographed by something ancient and wise. Their eye spots all seemed to focus on the nursery, on the new life that had joined the family. Ethan opened the window just a crack, not enough for them to enter, but enough to hear the humming of their wings. It was music, actual music, harmonious and complex, unlike anything he'd ever heard. Lily held Avery up slightly, and the baby's eyes tracked the movement of the moths, her tiny mouth forming an O of what looked like surprise. For an hour, maybe more, the moths performed their welcome ceremony. Leo stood at the window, his palms flat against the glass, and several moths clustered where his hands were, as if greeting an old friend. The connection between the boy and the creatures was obvious, a recognition that went both ways. Then, just as they had with Leo over a year ago, the moths began to glow. The bioluminescence was stronger this time, perhaps because there were so many more of them, and the entire cabin was bathed in golden light. It pulsed like a heartbeat, like the rhythm of life itself, and in that light everything seemed to shimmer with possibility. Avery made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a coo of contentment, and the moth's light pulsed brighter in response. They were acknowledging her, welcoming her, blessing her, as they had blessed her brother. Ethan felt Lily's hand in his, both of them crying silently, overwhelmed by the beauty and impossibility of what they were witnessing. This was their life now, a life where magic was real, where their children were known and protected by forces beyond understanding. The moths continued their dance until dawn approached, the sky beginning to lighten in the east. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, they began to disperse. But before they left entirely, something extraordinary happened. One moth, smaller than the others, with markings that seemed almost silver in the early morning light, flew to the partially open window. It hovered there, and Ethan, acting on instinct, held out his hand. The moth landed on his palm, its tiny feet tickling his skin, its wings folded delicately. It weighed almost nothing, but he could feel its life, its warmth, its purpose. It stayed for just a moment, and in that moment, Ethan felt a transfer of something. Not knowledge exactly, but understanding. The moths were guardians, had always been guardians, watching over the forest, and occasionally, when they sensed something special, extending that guardianship to human children. They were drawn to innocence, to potential, to the light that new souls brought into the world. The moth flew from his hand to Lily's shoulder, then to Leo's head, where it sat for a moment like a living crown, before finally hovering in front of Avery's face. The baby's eyes focused on it with surprising clarity, and for a heartbeat they simply regarded each other, the ancient creature and the brand-new human. Then the moth flew out the window, and all the others followed, disappearing into the forest as the sun painted the sky pink and gold. The cabin felt different in their absence, not empty but full, charged with blessing and promise. Leo climbed into Lily's lap, careful of his sister, and the four of them sat together, watching the sunrise, feeling like they'd been part of something sacred. In the days that followed, life with two children took on its own rhythm. Avery was as calm as Leo had been, rarely crying, often seeming to smile at things they couldn't see. The Moths came every night for a month, their numbers varying but their presence constant. Sometimes just a few, sometimes dozens, always at 2:17 a.m., always peaceful and purposeful. Leo would often wake to watch them, and they started bringing Avery to the window too, holding her up so she could see the dancing shadows and moving wings. The Moths seemed to respond to both children equally, their movements becoming more playful when both were watching, as if they were performing for an audience they particularly loved. Word spread quietly through the town about the Moths' return. People didn't speak of it directly, but Ethan noticed the knowing looks, the gentle smiles when they brought the children into town. Margaret from the library slipped him another journal, this one even older, with more stories, more sightings, dating back hundreds of years. The bear moths, it seemed, had been part of this place long before humans arrived, and they had chosen, for reasons known only to them, to sometimes interact with human families, always around births, always bringing the same sense of peace and blessing. It was a secret history, never written in official records, never studied by scientists, but preserved in whispers and personal journals, in the memories of those who had been touched by the magic. One night, when Avery was 6 weeks old, the same age Leo had been during his clearing ceremony, the large moth returned. It tapped at the window with the same urgent rhythm, the same clear invitation. This time, both Ethan and Lily went, carrying both children, following the moth through the forest to the same clearing, or perhaps a different one. It was hard to tell in the darkness. The scene was the same but more intense, hundreds of moths creating a living cathedral of wings and light. Leo walked on his own little legs into the center, fearless and laughing, while Ethan carried Avery. The moths swirled around them all, their bioluminescence creating patterns that seemed to tell stories, ancient tales written in light and movement. This time, Ethan understood more. The patterns weren't random, they were showing the history of the forest, the cycles of birth and death and rebirth that had played out here for millennia. They showed other children who had stood in this clearing, other families who had been blessed, a continuous thread of connection between the human world and the wild one. The moths were historians, keepers of memory, and they were adding Leo and Avery to their story, weaving them into the eternal narrative of the forest. When the ceremony ended, when the moths dispersed into the pre-dawn darkness, the family walked home in silence, each carrying the weight and wonder of what they'd witnessed. As months turned to years, the moths became part of the family's story, not everyday presences but regular visitors, appearing at significant moments. They came when Leo took his first steps, when Avery said her first word, when either child was sick or scared. Always at night, always gentle, always bringing that same sense of peace and protection. The children grew up knowing they were watched over, not just by their parents but by the forest itself, by creatures that existed in the margins of the known world. They never feared the dark, never felt alone, because they knew the moths were out there, just beyond sight, ready to appear when needed. Other families in the area had similar stories they learned over time. Not everyone saw the moths, but those who did formed an unofficial community, bound by shared wonder. They would nod to each other at the farmer's market, exchange knowing smiles at school events, understanding without words that their children had been touched by the same magic. It wasn't something they could explain to outsiders, to people who hadn't experienced it, so they didn't try. They simply held the secret close, passed it down to their children, and waited to see if the next generation would also be blessed with the moth's presence. When Leo was 5 and Avery was 4, old enough to understand stories, Ethan and Lily finally told them everything. About the first night the moths came, about the clearing ceremonies, about the blessing they'd received. The children listened with wide eyes, not surprised but satisfied, as if the story confirmed something they'd always known. "They still watch us," Leo said with certainty, and Aubrey nodded. "I see them sometimes, in my dreams," she added, and Lily believed her. The moths had left a mark on these children, not visible but undeniable, a connection to something larger than ordinary life. The family would sometimes walk to the clearing in daylight, finally able to find it now that the children seemed to know the way by instinct. It looked ordinary in sunlight, just a circle of trees with no sign of the magic that happened there at night. But the children would run around the space, arms spread like wings, laughing and calling to the moths they couldn't see but knew were there. These moments felt like prayers, like thank you notes sent into the forest, received by creatures that lived between worlds. The clearing became their special place, where they went when they needed to feel connected to the mystery that had blessed their lives. Time moved forward, as it does, and the children grew. The moths came less frequently, but never disappeared entirely. They would appear at important moments. The night before Leo started school, when Avery broke her arm falling from a tree, during thunderstorms that frightened the children. Always bringing comfort. Always reminding the family that they were part of something larger, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. The night light in the nursery stayed on, even after both children had moved to their own rooms, a beacon for the moths, a sign that this family remembered and welcomed them. When Leo was 7, he drew a picture at school of his family, including the moths. His teacher, Mrs. Chen, looked at it for a long moment, then quietly asked him to stay after class. She showed him a similar drawing, yellowed with age, that her own son had made 20 years ago. "You've seen them too," she said, and Leo nodded solemnly. She became another thread in the tapestry of connection, another person who understood that the world held more magic than most people knew. She told Leo stories of her own family's encounters with the moths, adding to the mythology that surrounded these creatures. Avery developed a different relationship with the moths. She seemed to sense them even when they weren't visible, often pausing in her play to look toward the forest, smiling at something only she could perceive. She would leave drawings for them on the windowsill, pictures of moths and children playing together. And sometimes in the morning, the papers would be moved, rearranged in patterns that looked deliberate. Whether it was wind or moths or imagination didn't matter. What mattered was the connection, the ongoing conversation between a little girl and the mysteries of the forest. The family's life was normal in most ways, school and work, groceries and laundry, all the mundane details that make up human existence. But underneath it all was this current of magic, this knowledge that they had been chosen for something special. It affected how they saw everything, made them more attentive to small wonders, more open to possibility. They noticed things others missed, the way certain trees seemed to lean toward their cabin, the unusual number of butterflies in their garden, the way wild animals seemed unafraid of their children. The moth blessing had changed them, made them part of the forest in a way that went beyond simply living near it. When friends from the city visited, they often commented on the peace of the place, the way the cabin seemed to exist in its own bubble of calm. Ethan and Lily would exchange glances but say nothing about the moths. Some secrets weren't meant to be shared widely, only passed to those who were ready to believe. But occasionally, very occasionally, a visitor would pause at the window at night, seeing something in the darkness, and ask hesitantly if there were unusual insects in the area. Then, and only then, would the story be told, adding another person to the circle of those who knew. Years flowed by like water. and the children grew into teenagers, then young adults. The moths aged with them, or perhaps different generations came, but they maintained their vigil. Less frequent now, but still present at the moments that mattered. They came the night before Leo left for college, covering his childhood window one last time, a farewell and a promise. They came when Avery won her first art competition, her painting of the clearing winning recognition from judges who didn't know they were looking at a real place, a sacred space. The moths were woven so deeply into the family's story that their absence would have felt wrong, like a missing thread in a tapestry. Leo studied biology in college, driven by a desire to understand the natural world that had shown him such wonder. He never mentioned the moths to his professors, knowing they existed outside the realm of traditional science, but his experiences with them informed everything he studied, gave him a perspective on the interconnectedness of life that went beyond textbooks. He knew there were things science couldn't explain yet, might never explain, and he was comfortable with that mystery. His research focused on symbiotic relationships in nature, the ways different species supported and protected each other, inspired by the relationship his family had with the moths. Avery became an artist, no surprise to anyone who knew her. Her work was full of hidden wings and watching eyes, subtle references to the moths that only those who knew the story would recognize. Her exhibitions drew people who seemed to sense something deeper in the paintings, something that spoke to experiences they couldn't quite articulate. She never explained the imagery directly, but occasionally someone would approach her after a show, mention strange moths they'd seen as a child, and she would know she'd found another person touched by the same magic. When Leo married and had his own children, the moths returned in force. The night his daughter was born, they covered every window of the hospital room, causing quite a stir among the nursing staff. But the head nurse, an elderly woman named Patricia, just smiled and closed the curtains. "I've seen them before," she said quietly. "They came for my granddaughter. You're blessed." The tradition continued. The magic passed to a new generation, the forest maintaining its ancient watch over those it had chosen to protect. Leo's daughter grew up as he had, knowing she was part of something special, watched over by guardians that most people never saw. Avery's children, when they came, received the same blessing. The moths seemed to multiply for them, as if celebrating the continuation of the connection. She painted murals in their nurseries, elaborate scenes of moths and moonlight that visitors assumed were fantasy but the family knew were documentary. The children grew up surrounded by this imagery, accepting as normal what others would consider impossible. They played games where they pretended to be moths, arms spread wide, dancing in circles, and sometimes, watching from the windows, real moths would mirror their movements. Ethan and Lily, now grandparents, still lived in the cabin where it all began. The night light still glowed in what had been the nursery, now a guest room for visiting grandchildren. The moths still came, less frequently but with the same purpose, checking on the family they had blessed decades ago. On quiet nights, Ethan would sometimes stand at the window, remembering that first night of tapping, the fear that had turned to wonder, the beginning of a story he never could have imagined. The forest around the cabin felt like an old friend now, known and knowing, keeping its secrets while sharing just enough magic to sustain belief. The clearing remained a sacred space for the family, a place they brought new members, new generations to tell the story. It never looked magical in daylight, but the children always knew it was special. They could feel it, the residue of all those ceremonies, all that light and movement and blessing. Sometimes they would find unusual feathers there, or stones arranged in patterns, or flowers that didn't grow anywhere else in the forest. Whether these were gifts from the moths or just the forest being itself didn't matter. What mattered was the continuation of wonder, the preservation of mystery in an increasingly known world. As Leo's and Avery's children grew, they too began to see the moths, began to understand their heritage. The magic wasn't diluted by being shared. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger with each generation, each child adding their own thread to the tapestry. They drew pictures, told stories, created their own mythologies around the moths, expanding the legend while keeping its core truth intact. The moths were protectors, blessing givers, bridges between the human world and something older and wilder. They were proof that magic still existed, that wonder wasn't just for fairy tales. The town itself seemed to benefit from the moth's presence, though most people didn't know it. Children who had been blessed by them grew up to be unusually kind, creative, connected to nature in ways that enriched the entire community. They became teachers and artists, doctors and gardeners, all carrying within them a spark of the magic they'd witnessed. The town had lower crime rates, higher happiness indices, more community cohesion than similar places. And while sociologists might attribute this to various factors, those who knew about the moths understood the real reason. The magic spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Margaret, from the library, now in her 90s, compiled all the stories she'd collected over the years into a private collection, kept in a special room that only certain people knew about. It was an archive of wonder, dozens of journals and drawings, photographs and paintings, all documenting encounters with the bear moths. She passed the guardianship of this collection to Leo when she retired, trusting him to preserve and protect these stories. He added his own family's experiences, creating a multi-generational record of magic that would be passed down through the years, proof for future generations that the impossible had happened, was still happening. The moths themselves seemed ageless, or perhaps they were many generations living the same patterns, following the same purpose. They showed no signs of diminishing, no indication that their magic was fading. If anything, they seemed to be expanding their reach, blessing more families, appearing in new places. Other towns in the region began reporting sightings, always around births, always bringing the same sense of peace and wonder. The network of those who had seen them grew, connected by social media groups with innocuous names, sharing stories and drawings, maintaining the secret while supporting each other in the knowledge of magic. Scientists occasionally came to study the unusual moth populations in the area, but the bear moths never appeared for them. They remained invisible to those who came looking with nets and notebooks, revealing themselves only to families, only around new life, only when their presence would be received as the gift it was. This selective visibility added to their mystery, made them more mythical than biological. Creatures that existed in the space between science and story. The scientists would leave with data about ordinary moths, never knowing they had missed the real wonder of the forest. 2 chapters of mentioned part has completed. The story continued through seasons and years, through births and deaths, through all the changes that time brings. The moths remained constant, a thread of continuity in an ever-changing world. New families moved to the area, drawn by something they couldn't name, and sometimes they too would be blessed with the moth's presence. The magic wasn't exclusive or jealous. It welcomed all who were open to wonder, all who could see beyond the ordinary into the extraordinary that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Children who had grown up with the moths carried the experience with them wherever they went. Even those who moved to cities, to other countries, reported occasional sightings. A single moth at a window during difficult times. a flutter of familiar wings in impossible places. The blessing, once given, seemed to follow them, a protective presence that transcended geography. They would tell their children about the moths, even those born far from the forest, keeping the story alive across distances and generations. The magic had become portable, carried in hearts and memories, ready to manifest when needed. The cabin in the woods became a pilgrimage site of sorts for the family, a place they returned to for important occasions. Weddings were held in the clearing, babies were brought to be introduced to the forest, elderly family members came to say goodbye. The moths didn't always appear, but their presence was felt, a sense of being watched over, protected, loved by something larger than human understanding. The place itself had absorbed decades of magic, becoming a battery of wonder that recharged those who spent time there. Local indigenous elders, when approached respectfully, shared their own stories of the moths, tales that went back generations before any written record. In their tradition, the moths were messengers between worlds, carriers of souls, protectors of innocence. They had different names for them, words that translated roughly to night blessings or wing prayers, but the essence was the same. The moths were sacred, not to be caught or studied, but to be received when they chose to appear. The elders smiled when they heard about the new families being blessed, nodding as if this was exactly as it should be. Artists and writers began to be drawn to the area, sensing something in the atmosphere that fed creativity. They didn't always know about the moths, but they felt their influence, the way the forest seemed more alive here, more conscious. Some of them would eventually see the moths and understand the source of the inspiration they'd felt. Others simply created work touched by magic they couldn't name, paintings and stories that carried hints of wings and wonder, spreading the influence of the moths even to those who would never see them directly. The children blessed by the moths grew up to be adults who saw the world differently. They were more likely to notice small beauties, to believe in possibilities, to maintain wonder despite the pressures of modern life. They raised their own children with this perspective, creating generations of people who knew that magic was real because they had witnessed it. This knowledge protected them from cynicism, from the deadening effect of too much reality, keeping alive the part of humanity that had always known there was more to existence than what could be measured and catalogued. Research into the moths, conducted privately by those who had seen them, revealed nothing that science could grab onto. They left no unusual chemical traces. Their DNA, when it could be collected from rare shed scales, seemed normal. They appeared on no infrared cameras, triggered no motion sensors. They existed in a blind spot of technology, visible only to human eyes and only under specific circumstances. This impossibility was part of their magic, proof that not everything in the world had been discovered, categorized, and explained. They were a reminder that mystery was not only possible but essential. The second generation of children blessed by the moths began to demonstrate unusual abilities, not supernatural, but enhanced. They were more intuitive, more connected to nature, more able to sense the emotional states of others. They grew up to be healers and counselors, teachers and environmentalists, people who worked to protect and nurture life in all its forms. The moth blessing seemed to activate something in human potential, bringing out the best of what people could be. Communities with moth-blessed families thrived in subtle but measurable ways. Scientists studying the region's unusual biodiversity began to notice patterns they couldn't explain. The forest around the cabin and similar blessed sites showed remarkable resilience to climate change, pollution, and other environmental stresses. The ecosystems were more balanced, more vibrant, more alive than they should be according to all models. Those who knew about the moths understood that their presence was part of this health, that they were not just visitors but guardians, maintaining the balance between the human and natural worlds in ways that went beyond current understanding. The moths began appearing in dreams, not just of those who had seen them, but of people connected to them. Distant relatives, close friends, sometimes even strangers who needed their particular kind of comfort. These dream moths brought messages, not in words, but in feelings, conveying comfort during grief, hope during despair, connection during loneliness. People would wake from these dreams feeling blessed, changed, touched by something they couldn't quite explain. The magic was spreading, carried on wings that could travel between waking and sleeping, between the possible and the impossible. Children's books began to appear, written by those who had seen the moths. Stories that seemed like fantasy but were based on truth. These books found their way to exactly the right children, those who needed to know that magic was real, that they were watched over, that wonder was not childish but essential. The illustrations in these books were so accurate that other moth-blessed families recognized them immediately, creating a secret bibliography of truth disguised as fiction. The moths had become literature, spreading their influence through story as they had always spread it through direct blessing. The climate crisis brought challenges to the forest, but the areas protected by the moths showed remarkable resilience. Trees that should have died thrived. Water sources that should have dried up remained clear and flowing. Environmental scientists couldn't explain it, but those who knew about the moths understood. The creatures were not just magical but necessary, playing a role in the ecosystem that science hadn't yet discovered. They were proof that nature had its own ways of protecting itself, its own magic that operated outside human understanding. As the years passed, the moth blessings became a quietly known phenomenon in certain circles. Midwives spoke of them in whispers, noting which births brought the moths. Pediatricians noticed that moth-blessed children rarely got seriously ill, seemed to recover faster from injuries, showed unusual emotional resilience. Teachers recognized them by their creativity, their kindness, their ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. The moths had created a network of enhanced humans, people touched by magic who were quietly changing the world for the better. The original cabin still stood, now weathered but solid, maintained by the family as a sacred trust. The nightlight still glowed every night, a beacon for the moths, a sign that the connection continued. New generations of children pressed their faces to the same windows, watching for wings in the darkness. The floorboards were worn smooth by decades of small feet running to see the moths. The walls held the memory of countless nights of wonder. It had become more than a house. It was a shrine to the possibility of magic, a physical anchor for something that transcended the physical. Ethan, now in his 80s, still woke sometimes at 2:17 a.m., the time burned into his biological clock by decades of moth visits. He would walk slowly to the window, looking out into the forest that had given his family such gifts. Sometimes he saw them, sometimes he didn't. But he always felt them, knew they were there, watching over his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He had lived a life touched by wonder, had raised children who knew magic was real, had been part of something larger than any single human life. The moths had given him not just moments of beauty, but an entire world view. A way of being that acknowledged mystery as essential to existence. Lily, painting still despite arthritis, created her masterpiece in her 70s. A massive canvas showing the clearing ceremony, every moth rendered in detail, the light captured so perfectly that viewers swore they could see it moving. The painting hung in the town library, in the special room Margaret had created, where those who knew could come and remember, and those who were ready to know could discover the truth. Children would stand before it, transfixed, and sometimes their parents would notice a recognition in their eyes, a memory of something they'd seen but hadn't understood until now. The moths evolved with the times, or perhaps they had always been timeless, and humans were just catching up. They began appearing to adopted children, to families formed in all the beautiful ways humans create kinship. They blessed refugee children arriving in the area, children born to single parents, children with two mothers or two fathers. Their magic was inclusive, recognizing love and new life in all its forms. The only constant was their appearance around innocence, around new beginnings, around the potential for wonder that every child carried into the world. Scientists finally captured clear footage of the moths, but when they tried to share it, the files corrupted, the images blurred, the evidence disappeared. It became a joke among those who knew. The moths had their own privacy settings, their own way of controlling their story. They would not be pinned down, categorized, explained away. They remained in the realm of the impossible, the magical, the true but unprovable. This resistance to documentation became part of their legend, proof that some things were meant to be experienced, not studied. The moth-blessed children grew up and had children of their own, and those children had children, creating an expanding web of humans touched by magic. They found each other in unexpected places, recognized each other by subtle signs, a way of looking at the world, a quality of attention, a capacity for wonder that survived into adulthood. They formed friendships, partnerships, communities built on the shared knowledge that the world was more magical than most people knew. The moths had created a tribe, scattered but connected, carrying their blessing forward through generations. Environmental restoration projects in the area had unusual success rates. Trees planted by moth-blessed individuals seemed to grow faster, stronger. Gardens they tended produced more abundant harvests. Water they protected stayed cleaner. It was as if the moth blessing extended beyond the human to everything the blessed ones touched, spreading health and vitality through the ecosystem. Scientists studying these successes couldn't identify the variable that made the difference, never knowing it was the influence of creatures they couldn't see, magic they didn't believe in. The stories of the moths began to merge with other stories, other mysteries. People reported seeing them in conjunction with other unexplained phenomena. Unusual aurora patterns, mysterious lights in the forest, inexplicable moments of synchronicity. The moths seemed to be part of a larger tapestry of magic that existed at the edges of the known world. Guardians not just of children but of wonder itself. They were proof that the universe was stranger and more beautiful than humanity had yet discovered. As technology advanced, attempts to study the moths with more sophisticated equipment all failed in interesting ways. Quantum sensors registered impossible readings. AI analysis programs crashed when processing moth footage. It was as if the moths existed partially outside the normal laws of physics. Or perhaps they operated according to laws that human science hadn't yet discovered. This consistent failure of technology to capture them became its own form of evidence, proof through absence, mystery confirmed by its resistance to solution. The moth-blessed families developed their own traditions around the creatures. They would leave offerings on full moon nights, not to feed the moths who never seemed to eat, but as gestures of gratitude. They would sing songs that had developed over the years, melodies that seemed to attract the moths when sung at the right frequency. They would tell the stories over and over, each telling, adding new details while preserving the essential truth. The moths had become not just a blessing, but a practice a way of living that honored mystery and magic. Children who had never seen the moths but had heard the stories began reporting sightings in impossible places, cities far from any forest, deserts where no moths should survive, even in other countries where bear moths had never been documented. Either the moths were spreading, or they had always been everywhere, waiting for the right eyes to see them. These scattered sightings created a global network of wonder, people united by having witnessed the impossible, having been touched by the same magic regardless of distance or culture. The influence of the moths could be traced through generations like a genetic marker, but one that operated outside of DNA. Families blessed by them showed patterns, increased creativity, stronger intuition, deeper connection to nature, unusual resilience in the face of hardship. Sociologists studying the area noticed these patterns but couldn't identify the cause, never knowing they were documenting the long-term effects of magical intervention. The moths had changed not just individual lives, but the entire fabric of the communities they touched. As climate change accelerated and the world faced increasing challenges, the moth-blessed individuals found themselves in positions to make a difference. They became the scientists developing sustainable technologies, the activists protecting forests, the teachers raising generations with different values. The moths' influence spread through human action. Their blessing translated into practical work to heal and protect the world. It was as if the moths had been preparing humanity for this moment, creating a network of people who could see beyond immediate profit to long-term survival. The clearing in the forest became a pilgrimage site for moth-blessed families from around the world. They would come quietly, without fanfare, to stand in the place where so many had been blessed. Sometimes the moths would appear for these gatherings, sometimes not. But the place itself held power. Children played there, feeling safe and watched over. Adults sat in meditation, reconnecting with the wonder of their childhood experiences. Elderly people came to give thanks for lives touched by magic. The clearing had become sacred ground, a thin place where the veil between the ordinary and the magical was gossamer thin. New technologies designed to detect dark matter registered anomalies around moth sighting areas, suggesting the creatures might exist partially in dimensions human science was just beginning to theorize about. This gave the scientifically minded among the moth-blessed a framework for understanding what they'd experienced. Not supernatural, but natural in ways humanity didn't yet understand. The moths were perhaps early evidence of a larger reality, ambassadors from aspects of existence that human consciousness was only beginning to be able to perceive. The stories passed down through moth-blessed families began to coalesce into a mythology, a shared narrative that gave meaning to their experiences. The moths were described as guardians of the threshold, beings that existed between worlds, drawn to moments of transition. Birth being the most powerful but not the only one. They appeared at other thresholds too, the edge between childhood and adulthood, between health and illness, between despair and hope. They were guides through transition, reminders that change, while scary, was also magical. Artists, influenced by moth encounters, created works that seemed to carry some of the moth's magic. Musicians composed pieces that, when played, seemed to thin the veil between worlds. Writers crafted stories that helped readers believe in possibility again. Visual artists painted or sculpted pieces that made viewers pause, feeling they were seeing something just beyond ordinary perception. The moth's influence had become cultural, spreading through human creativity to touch even those who would never see them directly. The moth-blessed children of the newest generation showed even stronger connections to the natural world. They could sense weather changes before instruments detected them, knew when animals were in distress, seemed to communicate with plants in ways that produced measurable results in growth and health. It was as if each generation's blessing built on the previous one, creating humans who were evolving back toward a connection with nature that modern life had severed. The moths were not just blessing individuals, but potentially guiding human evolution in a new direction. Religious and spiritual leaders began incorporating moth symbolism into their teachings, recognizing in the creatures a manifestation of divine grace that transcended specific traditions. The moths became symbols of universal blessing, of the sacred appearing in unexpected forms, of the divine attention that watches over all new life. They were proof that mystery and meaning were not opposites but partners, that the unknown could be a source of comfort rather than fear. The economic impact of the moth phenomenon, though never officially measured, was significant. The areas where they appeared thrived in subtle ways. Small businesses succeeded, communities cohered, property values rose without pricing out long-term residents. It was as if the moth's blessing extended to the economic ecosystem as well, creating abundance that was shared rather than hoarded. Economists studying the region's unusual prosperity couldn't identify the factors that made it different, never knowing they were witnessing the practical effects of magic. As the story spread, filtered through books and art and whispered conversations, more people began watching for the moths, not hunting them, but simply being open to their appearance. This openness itself seemed to invite magic, creating conditions where other wonders could occur. People reported synchronicities, moments of unexpected beauty, connections that defied probability. The moths had taught humanity how to see magic again, how to expect wonder, how to live in a world where the impossible was always possible. The scientific community gradually split into those who dismissed moth sightings as mass delusion and those who quietly acknowledged that something unexplained was happening. The latter group, many of them moth-blessed themselves or related to someone who was, began developing new frameworks for understanding reality that could accommodate both rigorous science and genuine mystery. They were pioneering what some called post-materialist science, an approach that didn't deny physical reality but acknowledged that physical reality might be far stranger than previously thought. Children's hospitals in the region began reporting unusual patterns: faster healing times, lower infection rates, better psychological outcomes. No one could explain it, but those who knew about the moths understood. The creature's influence extended beyond direct blessing to create fields of healing, zones where life force was stronger, where recovery was easier. Some families brought sick children to the forest, not for any specific treatment but simply to be in the presence of whatever magic the moths had brought to the place. The moth blessing seemed to offer protection against the despair that could come from living in difficult times. Those who had seen them maintained hope more easily, found meaning more readily, connected with others more deeply. They were not immune to suffering but seemed to have an additional resource for dealing with it, a deep knowledge that beauty and magic persisted even in darkness. This psychological resilience was perhaps the most practical gift the moths gave, the ability to face an uncertain future without losing wonder. As the years became decades, and the decades accumulated into a century, since Ethan first heard the tapping at Leo's window, the moth phenomenon had become an established if unofficial part of human experience. Thousands of families around the world had now been blessed, creating a network of magic that strengthened with each new connection. The moths had gone from being a local mystery to a global one, proof that wonder was not limited by geography or culture, but was a universal human birthright. The forest around the original cabin had become a nature preserve, protected by law, but more importantly, by love. The moth-blessed families had pooled resources to buy the land, ensuring it would never be developed, never be destroyed. They maintained it lightly, clearing paths and removing invasive species, but mostly letting it be what it had always been. A place where magic felt closer to the surface, where the impossible became possible, where moths the size of hands danced for babies and blessed them with wonder. New research into consciousness and quantum mechanics began providing theoretical frameworks that could potentially explain the moths. Perhaps consciousness was more fundamental than previously thought. Perhaps observation really did affect reality at scales larger than the quantum. Perhaps the moths existed in a state of quantum superposition, neither fully here nor fully not here, collapsing into visibility only when observed by consciousness in particular states, the innocence of babies, the open wonder of those ready to see. These theories were far from proven, but they offered the scientifically minded a way to think about what they'd experienced. The moth-blessed formed support groups, both online and in person, for those struggling to integrate their experiences. Seeing the moths could be overwhelming, forcing a reconsideration of everything one thought was true about reality. These groups helped people process the experience, understand it as a gift rather than a burden. Learn to live with the knowledge that magic was real. They became communities of wonder, places where the impossible could be discussed as fact, where mystery was celebrated rather than solved. Environmental scientists studying why certain forests thrived despite climate change began to notice correlations with moth sightings, though they didn't understand the connection. Areas where moths had been seen showed greater biodiversity, stronger ecosystem resilience, faster recovery from disturbances. It was as if the moths were indicator species for something, not just environmental health, but environmental magic, places where life force was particularly strong. Conservation efforts began unconsciously prioritizing these areas, protecting magic without knowing it. The children, blessed by moths, grew up to create innovations that seemed to come from nowhere. New technologies that worked with nature rather than against it. Social systems that prioritized well-being over profit. Agricultural methods that increased both yield and soil health. When asked where their ideas came from, they often couldn't say, just that they'd always known there was a better way. The moth's blessing seemed to include access to knowledge that wasn't learned but remembered, as if they'd awakened dormant human capacities for harmony with the natural world. As the moth stories spread, they began to merge with other cultural traditions about guardian spirits, fairy godmothers, and protective beings. Scholars of mythology noticed parallels with ancient stories from around the world, suggesting the moths might be a modern manifestation of something humans had always known existed. They were proof that the archetypal patterns Jung had identified weren't just psychological, but might represent actual forces in the world. Beings that had always watched over humanity but revealed themselves in forms appropriate to each era. The economic systems in moth-influenced areas began developing in unusual directions, prioritizing sustainability and community well-being over pure growth. Businesses made decisions that didn't maximize profit but did maximize benefit for all stakeholders, including the environment. It was as if the moth blessing included an understanding that individual well-being was inseparable from collective well-being, that true prosperity meant everyone thriving. These areas became models for what some economists called post-growth capitalism, systems that could maintain prosperity without destroying the planet. Children who had never been directly blessed by the moths but had grown up hearing the stories showed their own forms of enhancement. They were more likely to believe in possibility, to maintain wonder into adulthood, to make choices based on hope rather than fear. The moth stories themselves had become a form of blessing, spreading the magic through narrative rather than direct encounter. This suggested that the moth's true gift might not be their physical presence, but the change in consciousness their presence created, the opening to wonder that rippled outward through story and art. The newest generation of moth-blessed children began showing abilities that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. They could find lost objects with unusual accuracy, seemed to know when loved ones far away were in trouble, could calm frightened animals with their presence. These abilities were subtle, deniable, but consistent across moth-blessed populations. It was as if the moths were gradually preparing humanity for a different kind of existence, one where the boundaries between self and other, human and nature, possible and impossible were more fluid. Religious institutions in the area began incorporating the moth phenomenon into their theology, seeing in them evidence of continuing divine intervention in the world. The moths became proof that miracles hadn't ended with ancient times, but continued in forms appropriate to the current era. Sermons referenced them, prayers thanked them, and children's religious education included stories of the moths alongside traditional texts. The creatures had become part of the sacred narrative of the community, woven into its spiritual fabric. The moth sightings began to show patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose beyond simple instinct. They appeared to families just before major challenges, as if preparing them. They came in greater numbers during community crises, their presence offering comfort that helped people pull together. They seemed to know things, which children needed extra blessing, which families were struggling, which moments required their particular form of magic. This responsiveness suggested consciousness, intention, perhaps even compassion in forms humans were only beginning to recognize. Artists who had been blessed by the moths found their work taking on qualities they hadn't consciously intended. Paintings seemed to glow with their own light. Music contained harmonies the composers hadn't written, but were there when performed. Stories had layers of meaning that revealed themselves to different readers, as if the moth magic had infected the creative process itself. These works became vehicles for spreading the moth influence, carrying wonder to those who experienced them. The scientific instruments that failed to capture the moths began registering something else: fields of unusual energy around moth sighting areas, patterns that didn't match any known phenomenon. These fields seemed to promote biological flourishing, speed healing, enhance cognitive function. Some researchers began to suspect the moths were not just magical, but were performing some kind of ecological function science didn't yet understand, perhaps facilitating energy flows between dimensions or states of being. The moth-blessed families developed rituals around their experiences, ways of honoring and maintaining their connection to the magic. They would gather on significant dates to share stories and renew their commitment to wonder. They created art together, collaborative pieces that seemed to channel the moth energy. They raised their children with specific practices, spending time in nature, cultivating attention to small wonders, maintaining openness to the impossible. These rituals strengthened the moth influence, creating cultural containers for magic. As the world faced increasing challenges, climate change, social division, economic inequality, the moth-blessed found themselves uniquely equipped to respond. They had maintained hope in the face of the impossible, had experienced grace in unexpected forms, knew viscerally that solutions could come from beyond current understanding. They became leaders not through ambition but through their ability to see possibilities others couldn't, to maintain faith in beauty and meaning even in dark times. The moths began appearing in mass media, always in the background, never the focus but consistently present. They showed up in news footage of happy events, in the corner of viral videos, in the background of photos that became inexplicably popular. It was as if they were slowly introducing themselves to humanity at large, preparing the collective consciousness for a wider revelation. Those who knew what to look for could spot them everywhere, a hidden pattern in the weave of human experience. Children born into moth-blessed families seemed to arrive with the blessing already active, as if it had become hereditary in some non-genetic way. These children showed the signs from birth: unusual calm, deep attention, connection to nature. They grew up taking magic for granted, living in a world where wonder was normal, where the impossible was just another aspect of reality. They were perhaps the first generation of humans fully adapted to a magical world, native speakers of wonder. The economic value of properties in moth-sighting areas increased, but in unusual ways. They became valuable not for development, but for preservation, bought by people who wanted to protect the magic rather than profit from it. A new form of economy developed around these places, based on pilgrimage, retreat, and healing, rather than extraction or exploitation. The moths had changed the very concept of value, making magic more precious than money. Scientists studying longevity noticed that moth-blessed individuals lived longer, healthier lives, but couldn't identify any biological mechanism to explain it. They aged more slowly, maintained cognitive function longer, seemed to have an extra reservoir of life force. Some researchers suspected the moth blessing might activate dormant genetic potentials, turning on DNA sequences that modern life had switched off. Others thought it might be purely psychological, the life-extending power of maintained wonder. Either way, the effect was measurable and consistent. The moth phenomenon began to influence architecture and urban planning. Cities with moth-blessed populations started designing spaces that invited wonder, buildings with windows positioned to catch moonlight, parks designed to feel like forest clearings, light pollution reduced to allow night visibility. These changes were subtle but significant, creating urban environments that didn't shut out magic, but invited it in. The moths had inspired a reformation of human habitats, making them more permeable to wonder. Children's education in moth-influenced areas evolved to include what some called wonder literacy, the ability to perceive and appreciate mystery, to live comfortably with the unknown, to recognize magic when it appeared. These children scored higher on creativity tests, showed greater emotional resilience, demonstrated enhanced problem-solving abilities. The moth blessing had become pedagogical, teaching through presence rather than curriculum, showing that education could be about opening to possibility rather than just accumulating facts. The Global Moth Network began coordinating responses to environmental crises. Without formal organization, moth-blessed individuals found themselves working together, their efforts surprisingly effective. They seemed to know where to focus attention, which battles could be won, how to create change that would stick. Some observers noted it was as if they were being guided by an intelligence that could see patterns humans couldn't, perhaps the same intelligence that guided the moths themselves. Religious and spiritual teachers began reporting that moth-blessed individuals were easier to guide toward enlightenment or spiritual awakening. They had already experienced the crack in ordinary reality that allowed larger truths to enter. They knew viscerally that consciousness was more than brain function. That meaning was woven into the fabric of existence, that love and beauty were not human projections but fundamental forces. The moths had been spiritual teachers, preparing humans for expanded consciousness. The influence of the moths could be traced through history once people knew what to look for. Ancient texts described similar creatures. Cave paintings showed moth-like beings around human figures. Folklore from every continent included stories of protective night visitors. The moths, it seemed, had always been with humanity, revealing themselves more fully now because humanity was ready, or perhaps because humanity needed them more than ever. They were not new, but newly visible, not alien, but intimate companions in the human journey. As technology advanced toward artificial intelligence and virtual reality, the moth-blessed provided a crucial counterbalance. They insisted on the irreplaceable value of embodied experience, of actual rather than simulated wonder, of magic that couldn't be programmed or replicated. They became advocates for what they called original reality, the world where moths could appear at windows, where blessings came in unexpected forms, where mystery was not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be received. The children of moth-blessed families began showing artistic abilities that seemed to come from nowhere. They could paint before they could write, compose music before they learned instruments, tell stories that made adults weep with their beauty. It was as if the moth blessing had opened channels to creativity that bypassed normal learning processes. These children grew up to revolutionize art, creating works that seemed to carry the moth magic forward, spreading wonder through beauty. Environmental restoration projects led by moth-blessed individuals had success rates that defied explanation. Degraded ecosystems recovered faster than science said was possible. Extinct species reappeared. Water sources that had been poisoned became clean. It was as if the moth blessing extended to the land itself, allowing those who carried it to facilitate healing that went beyond normal physical processes. Some areas became known as miracle sites, places where the impossible became possible. The moth phenomenon began to influence technology development in unexpected ways. Engineers blessed by moths created designs that seemed to violate efficiency principles, but worked better than anything previous. Programmers wrote code that seemed to anticipate needs, to respond to intentions rather than just commands. It was as if the moth magic was teaching humanity how to create technologies that worked with rather than against the grain of reality, tools that enhanced rather than replaced wonder. Families that had been blessed by moths for multiple generations began to notice cumulative effects. Each generation seemed to start where the previous one had piked, building on rather than repeating the journey toward wonder. These multi-generational moth families became wisdom keepers, holding knowledge about how to live with magic, how to raise children who took wonder for granted, how to maintain the blessing across time. They were living proof that magic could be cultivated, strengthened, passed on. The economic systems in heavily moth-influenced areas evolved into something economists struggled to categorize. They weren't capitalist or socialist, but something new. Systems based on gift economy principles, but with sophisticated mechanisms for ensuring everyone's needs were met. Resources flowed to where they were needed, without central planning or pure market forces. It was as if the moth blessing included an understanding of how to organize human activity in harmony with natural patterns. Scientists studying the moth phenomenon began to develop what they called post-empirical methodologies, ways of studying things that couldn't be fully captured by traditional scientific methods. These approaches acknowledge that some aspects of reality might be participatory, requiring the observer to be in particular states to perceive them. The moths had forced an evolution in science itself, pushing it toward frameworks that could accommodate both rigor and mystery. The influence of the moths on human consciousness became a subject of study for philosophers and cognitive scientists. The blessing seemed to activate what some called holotropic consciousness, awareness that moved toward wholeness, that could perceive connections and patterns normally invisible. This wasn't just psychological, but seemed to involve actual changes in brain function, new neural pathways that processed reality differently. The moths were evolution in action, but evolution of consciousness rather than just biology. Children raised with moth stories, even if they'd never seen the creatures themselves, showed different patterns of development. They maintained imaginative play longer, showed less anxiety about the unknown, demonstrated greater capacity for joy. The stories themselves seemed to be a mild form of the blessing, preparing consciousness for wonder even without direct encounter. This suggested the moth's influence spread through narrative as much as through presence. That story itself could be a vehicle for magic. The global response to the moth phenomenon varied by culture but showed surprising consistency. Indigenous peoples often said, "They've returned," rather than "they've appeared," suggesting long cultural memory of the creatures. Modern secular societies struggled more with the implications, but couldn't deny the evidence. Religious communities split between those who saw the moths as divine messengers and those who feared they were deceptions. But across all these responses was a common thread: the recognition that something extraordinary was happening. As the moth influence spread, it began to affect global politics in subtle ways. Leaders who had been moth-blessed made different decisions, prioritized different values, seemed able to see longer-term consequences. International agreements that had been stalled for decades suddenly found resolution. Conflicts that had seemed intractable discovered unexpected paths to peace. It was as if the moth blessing included enhanced capacity for finding harmony, for seeing past surface divisions to deeper connections. The children, blessed by moths, began to age differently, maintaining the openness and wonder of childhood even as they developed adult capacities. They were serious without being cynical, responsible without being rigid, wise without losing playfulness. They represented a new form of human maturity, one that didn't require the sacrifice of magic for the sake of functionality. They were proof that growing up didn't have to mean giving up wonder. Environmental scientists studying climate change impacts noticed that moth-influenced areas showed unusual resilience. Not immunity to change, but adaptation that seemed guided by intelligence. Ecosystems reorganized in ways that maintained function despite altered conditions. Species that should have gone extinct found new niches. It was as if the moth presence helped nature itself become more creative, more adaptive, more capable of responding to rapid change. The moth phenomenon began to influence medicine and healing. Doctors who had been moth-blessed reported knowing things about patients they couldn't explain, finding diagnoses through intuition confirmed by tests, sensing which treatments would work beyond what protocol suggested. Patients treated by moth-blessed healers recovered faster, reported experiences of profound peace during treatment, sometimes described seeing moths in their hospital rooms though none were physically present. Artists influenced by moth encounters created a new movement some called magical realism realized. Works that depicted the extraordinary as ordinary, the impossible as everyday. These pieces didn't ask viewers to suspend disbelief but to expand it, to consider that reality might be far stranger and more wonderful than commonly assumed. The movement spread globally, changing how people thought about the relationship between art and truth, imagination and reality. The economic value of moth blessings became a subject of quiet study by corporations and governments. Areas with high concentrations of moth-blessed individuals showed increased innovation, better workplace satisfaction, more sustainable business practices. Some organizations began unofficially recruiting moth-blessed employees, recognizing they brought something invaluable, though indefinable. The moths had become an economic force, but one that operated by different rules than traditional capitalism. Children born to moth-blessed parents in cities far from forests began reporting moth sightings in impossible places. Apartment windows 20 stories up, urban parks with no suitable habitat, even in other countries where the moths shouldn't exist. Either the moths were spreading beyond their original territory, or they had always been everywhere, waiting for the right conditions to appear. The phenomenon was becoming global, suggesting the magic wasn't limited to particular places, but was available wherever wonder was welcomed. The influence of moth blessings on human relationships became apparent over time. Moth-blessed individuals formed unusually strong communities, marriages that lasted, friendships that endured across distance and time. They seemed to recognize each other, drawn together by shared wonder. These relationships had a quality of depth and authenticity that stood out in an increasingly disconnected world. The moths had blessed not just individuals, but their capacity for connection. Scientists studying the moth phenomenon began to suspect they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just a biological curiosity, but possibly first contact with a form of intelligence that operated by different rules than human consciousness. The moth's behavior suggested purpose, responsiveness, even compassion, but in forms that didn't match any earthly evolution. Some researchers began to consider whether the moths might be ambassadors from another dimension, another state of being, or another form of consciousness altogether. The stories of moth blessings began to change human mythology, adding new archetypal patterns to the collective unconscious. The moths became symbols of hope in dark times, proof that help could come from unexpected sources. Reminders that humans were not alone in the universe. They appeared in dreams, in art, in the stories people told themselves about what was possible. They had become part of human consciousness, whether individuals had seen them or not. As the effects of moth blessings accumulated across generations and geography, some observers began to suggest humanity was experiencing speciation. Not biological, but consciousness evolution. Moth-blessed humans seem to represent a new form of human being, one adapted to a world where magic and mystery were real, where wonder was practical, where the impossible was always possible. They were perhaps the first members of what would eventually become a new species, Homo mysterium, humans of mystery. The forest where it all began, where Ethan first heard the tapping at Leo's window, had become a place of pilgrimage for moth-blessed families from around the world. They came quietly, respectfully, to stand in the place where the modern moth phenomenon had started. The cabin still stood, maintained by Leo's descendants, the nightlight still glowing in the window. Visitors often reported seeing moths there even during daylight, even in seasons when moths shouldn't be active. The place had become thin, the boundary between ordinary and magical reality worn gossamer by decades of wonder. Scientists studying the area found anomalies they couldn't explain. Unusual electromagnetic fields, quantum fluctuations that shouldn't exist at macro scales, biological diversity that defied ecological principles. The forest had become a laboratory for studying the impossible, a place where the laws of physics seemed more flexible, where consciousness and matter interacted in ways that challenged every assumption. Some researchers spent their entire careers trying to understand what made this place different, never quite succeeding but forever changed by the attempt. The influence of the moths on human culture became undeniable. They appeared in literature, film, music, and art, sometimes overtly but often as subtle presence, a background magic that influenced without demanding attention. They had become part of the human story, woven so deeply into culture that future generations might not remember a time before moth blessings. They were proof that magic could become normal without losing its power, that wonder could be every day without becoming mundane, Children blessed by moths grew up to ask different questions than their peers. Instead of, "How can I succeed?" they asked, "How can we all thrive?" Instead of, "What's in it for me?" they wondered, "What's needed here?" They seemed to operate from a different center, one that recognized individual well-being as inseparable from collective flourishing. They became natural leaders not through ambition but through their ability to see and serve the whole. The moths had blessed them with a consciousness that transcended the illusion of separation. The economic systems influenced by moth-blessed populations began to spread, offering alternatives to both capitalism and socialism. These systems recognized value beyond monetary exchange, accounting for beauty, wonder, ecological health, and community well-being in their calculations. They were complex but intuitive, requiring wisdom rather than just intelligence to navigate. Economists studying them suggested they might represent the future of human economic organization, systems that could sustain both human thriving and planetary health. As more children were born to moth-blessed parents, researchers noticed they seemed to arrive with abilities already activated. They showed unusual awareness from birth, responded to nature in ways that suggested deep recognition, seemed to understand things they hadn't been taught. It was as if the moth blessing had become inheritable, passed through some mechanism that transcended genetics. These children were native to a magical world, taking for granted what their parents had struggled to believe. The moth phenomenon forced a reconsideration of mental health paradigms. Experiences that would have been labeled delusional, seeing enormous moths that others couldn't see, believing in magical blessings, feeling connected to mysterious forces, were now recognized as valid perceptions of an expanded reality. Therapists had to develop new frameworks for distinguishing between mental illness and genuine mystical experience. The moths had complicated the boundaries between sanity and madness, showing that sometimes what seemed crazy was actually a more complete view of reality. Environmental movements influenced by moth-blessed individuals took on different characteristics. Rather than operating from fear or anger about ecological destruction, they worked from love and wonder for what remained. They were protectors rather than fighters, gardeners rather than warriors. Their effectiveness came not from confrontation but from cultivation, creating alternatives so beautiful and functional that the old destructive ways simply became obsolete. The moths had taught them that transformation came through blessing rather than battle. The influence of moths on human spirituality transcended religious boundaries. They became symbols of divine attention that didn't require specific beliefs or practices to receive. They appeared to atheists and believers alike, blessing without discrimination. This universal quality made them bridges between different spiritual traditions, proof that the sacred could manifest in forms that no single religion owned. They were reminders that mystery was larger than any human framework for understanding it. As the moth-blessed population grew, they began to influence human evolution in unexpected ways. Not through genetic changes, but through cultural evolution, passing on ways of being that prioritized wonder, connection, and ecological harmony. They were creating a new form of human culture, one adapted to a world where magic was real, where consciousness and matter were intimately connected, where the impossible was always possible. This cultural evolution was perhaps more significant than any biological change, representing a fundamental shift in what it meant to be human. The stories of moth blessings became teaching tools in schools influenced by moth-blessed educators. Children learned history that included mystery, science that acknowledged wonder, art that channeled magic. These educational approaches produced students who were both rigorously trained and openly creative, capable of precise thinking without losing imaginative flexibility. The Moths had inspired a revolution in pedagogy, showing that education could expand rather than limit consciousness. Scientists studying the moth phenomenon eventually developed theories that could partially explain their existence. They might be plasma-based life forms, creatures of organized energy rather than matter. They might exist primarily in dimensions beyond the standard 4, only partially manifesting in normal space-time. They might be manifestations of consciousness itself, taking form in response to human awareness. None of these theories fully explained the moths, but they expanded science's framework for understanding reality. The economic impact of moth tourism became significant in areas where sightings were common, but this was tourism of a different kind: quiet, respectful, transformative. Visitors came not to consume experiences but to open to possibility. Local economies evolved to support this gentler form of visitation, creating spaces for reflection, wonder, and potential encounter. The moths had inspired an economy of pilgrimage rather than exploitation. Children who grew up with moth blessings showed unusual patterns of brain development. Neural imaging revealed increased connectivity between regions normally separate, enhanced activity in areas associated with creativity and intuition, novel patterns that neuroscientists couldn't fully interpret. It was as if the moth blessing rewired the brain for expanded consciousness, creating hardware capable of running software that transcended ordinary human limitations. The influence of moths on conflict resolution became apparent as moth-blessed individuals increasingly became mediators and peacemakers. They seemed able to see past surface disagreements to deeper shared needs, to hold space for multiple perspectives without losing their center. Conflicts that had seemed intractable found resolution when moth-blessed mediators were involved. They brought something beyond technique, a quality of presence that allowed new possibilities to emerge. As climate change accelerated, the wisdom of the moth-blessed became increasingly valuable. They seemed to know intuitively how to adapt, where to focus efforts, what changes would be sustainable. Their guidance helped communities navigate challenges that might have been devastating. It was as if the moths had been preparing humanity for this time, creating a network of wisdom keepers who could guide the species through transformation. The artistic works created by moth-blessed individuals began to show consistent themes across cultures: spirals, eye patterns, images of transformation, representations of light emerging from darkness. These weren't consciously coordinated but seemed to emerge from shared experience, creating a visual language of wonder that transcended cultural boundaries. Art historians studying this phenomenon suggested it might represent the emergence of a new artistic movement, one based on actual rather than imagined transcendence. The influence of moths on human consciousness became so pervasive that philosophers began to speak of before moth and after moth periods in human development. The appearance of the moths marked a transition point, a moment when humanity began to remember magic, to reintegrate wonder into its worldview. This shift was subtle but profound, changing not just what humans believed, but how they experienced reality itself. Children blessed by moths grew up to create technologies that seemed to operate on different principles, devices that responded to intention rather than just input, systems that self-organized in ways that enhanced rather than replaced human capabilities, tools that seemed to work with natural patterns rather than against them. These technologies were difficult to reverse engineer because they incorporated principles that standard engineering didn't recognize. The moths had inspired a new form of technology, one that enhanced rather than replaced human consciousness. The global moth-blessed community began to coordinate without formal organization, responding collectively to crises and opportunities. They seemed to know when to act and where to focus, as if guided by shared intuition. This coordination transcended language and culture, suggesting connection at a level deeper than normal human communication. Some researchers suggested they might be demonstrating a form of collective consciousness, individual minds linked by their shared blessing. As the moth phenomenon entered its second century, patterns became clear that hadn't been visible at first. The blessings came in waves, appearing more frequently during times of crisis or transformation. They seemed to respond to human need, offering their magic when it was most necessary. This responsiveness suggested not just intelligence but compassion, a desire to help humanity through difficult transitions. The moths were not just observers but active participants in human evolution. The influence of moths on human society had become so profound that imagining a world without them became difficult. They had changed how humans understood reality, related to nature, raised children, organized communities, created art, developed technology. They had been catalysts for transformation at every level of human experience. The tapping at Leo's window that night long ago had been the beginning of a new chapter in the human story, one where magic was real and wonder was practical.